So, welcome back everybody. We're again in the house of Professor Abdullah Schleifer, and we're going to continue with the reading of Ananda K.Coomaraswamy's article, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Indra and Namuci, and we're on about page 2 now. Did the first page last time?
Yes, we're now on deep into page 2.
Deep into page 2. So, over to you, Kai.
So this Namuci, whose name means hold fast, is a pharaoh who will not let his people go, nor release the waters. He's the equivalent, as we find in Ezekiel, for example. The pharaoh who will not allow the Red Sea to release the Israelites. That's me putting that in. But he says it's known by many other names, as Ahi, which means serpent or dragon, Vrtra, enveloper or roller, Sushna, sirocco, drought, Maha, fury, Vishvarupa, omniform, protean, and is explicitly or implicitly identified with Soma, Vishnu, Varuna, Brahma, Atman, Agni, and Prajapati in their sacrificial aspects as the source from which all things come forth. These are the forms of the arch-titan, Ashura, whom the heroic god Deva, Indra, fights on behalf of his followers, alone or with their aid, but who is also often represented as willingly surrendering himself to the gods to be dismembered in order that they may live. The temporally everlasting opposition of the gods and titans, in which the human sacrificer participates, is the basic theme of the Vedic tradition, but it must not be overlooked that the opponents are really brothers, or that Namuci was Indra's bosom friend and boon companion before the battle, or that in the early English story, conversely, Gawain becomes the Green Knight's friend and honoured guest when all is over. In the creation myth of RV, what's RV stand for? Rig Veda. The primordial person, Purusha, is divided up so that sky from his head evolved, and from his feet the earth. This subdivision of the primordial man has been often and justly compared to that of the giant Ymir, from whose flesh the earth was shapen, and heaven from his skull. That's in the Nordic tradition. So too in the Babylonian myth, Marduk bisects Tiamat and makes heaven of her upper part. Otherwise stated, this is Prajapati's assumption of his world form, in which the sky is his head and the earth his feet. That's from the Upanishad. A conception of the body of God that is reflected in the universal, architectural symbolism, in which the house is a representation of the macrocosm and at the same time of the human microcosm, its domed roof being on the one hand the vault above us, and on the other to our own skull cap, and the luffa or oculus of the dome to the sun on the other hand, and to the other to the bregmatic fontanelle. Kittredge remarks that it is very common for denizens of the other world to be regarded as Ophidian, and concludes that the general class of monsters who play fast and loose with their heads were, in the original conception, though not in the actual tale that we are investigating, snakes or serpent men. It is very interesting to find that Kittredge could reach this important and very significant conclusion from the materials available to him, for to say nothing of Zeus, who like Asclepius was once a snake, and that must be understood not only historically but also ontologically, or of the Aztec winged serpent, or Chinese dragon, the primordial being out of whom, whether as Vrtra or Mahabhuta or Brahma Yoni or Atman, all these things are brought forth in the beginning, is typically Ophidian, a proposition that applies as well to the feminine as to the masculine aspects of the divine by unity. As we have elsewhere remarked, the bisection of the serpent may be equated with the direction of heaven and earth. Indra bisected Vrtra. It is only to say the same thing in other words and from the point of view of the person himself that he bisected himself, thus dividing the male and female principles that had been one in his androgynous unity. that division of the man from the woman. For in this way, partis kapatni ka abwartam, and observe that the man is the head of the woman, as is Christ of the church, is at the same time the schism of the sacerdotium from the regnum, sky from the earth, knower from known, and in general of all the pairs of opposite tensions or values that make a mortal world, and a separation of the two selves that dwell together in us, respectively immortal and mortal, and that it is only by the performance of the sacred marriage, ritually and within you, that the broken image of the immanent deity can be made whole again.
Mm-hmm. Well, shall we stop there? And
well, that ends on a very alchemical point, doesn't it? Wow, there is a lot for people listening to this. It, as you said, when you read it yourself, you find it so dense. The references themselves so dense and so varied, and also because they are on such a deep ontological level of symbolism, that actually you find yourself having to stop and weigh each sentence and each reference, just to allow the resonance of it to sit before you can move on. I'm wondering how easy it's going to be for an audience to take this, read by someone else, so they're not even observing the words with their own eyes, which is part of the translation process. When you're reading, you're translating from the words that you are seeing. You're going to need to be some kind of master to be able to keep up with the text as read by me for the first time.
Yeah. So could I ask you to explain a little bit further than Coomaraswamy did about the androgyne, the primordial androgyne? And is this identical to what in Kabbalism is called the Adam Kadmon, the primordial Adam?
That's an interesting point. Prior to any idea of the masculine or the feminine, prior to, as it were, in the lower Adam, Eve being created from one of his ribs to give him a partner, until that point there is no mention of gender. So Adam Kadmon is implicitly androgynous. He is man, the idea of man, in unity, a unity that directly reflects the divine unicity, although the divine unicity has already dissolved itself in order to give of itself a creation wherein Adam Kadmon can appear. So gender doesn't even begin to come into the story until God is actually separating within his creation. Because once we have Adam and Eve, then we have the animals coming in their pairs. But having said that, the duality is already implicit as soon as the divine, which is absolute and untouched in its unicity, as soon as the divine, through whatever mysterious process, decides to dissolve its unicity and give of itself, to apply, allow creation to happen where multiplicity will then enter. This is a great sacrifice, and in a sense is a decapitation of the unicity of God, which in that mysterious state can be seen at best symbolically as a zero. So it's a zero, it's a nothing, it is no thing. The divine is no thing. It is nothing. The closest we can get to representing nothing is with a thing that happens to be a zero. But it's the best representation we can have of no thing. The symbol for the sun, and it's interesting because the decapitations that we're talking about here, and the, as it were, the breaking down into multiplicity, where heads are becoming sons. It's interesting that, let me not lose my, I'm going to have to pause this while I remember my point.
The alchemical symbol of the sun is a circle
yes.
with a dot in it.
So you have the circle. When you have the circle with the dot in it, that is the symbol of the sun. It's the alchemical symbol of the sun. Still, it's used in astrology, universally recognized. That's, as it were, the inseminated egg.
Mm.
So when you have the 0, you can see it as that which represents nothing in terms of numerology, as a non-number, but it also represents the egg, and it's the fertilized egg. And it is, in a sense, the idea, and you have this in the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, where he addresses the way in which the one, through mediation, generates the great work. And this reminds me of the Ouroboros, and the Ouroboros is the circle represented by the serpent with its tail in its mouth. And the Ouroboros represents the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the beginning that finds its end in itself, and the end that finds its beginning in itself, which is a representation of the totality of the divine upon the point of creation. And there is a sense in which the tail, because God knows his beginning and his end, even in a state where no beginning or end is even expressed, that he makes his own point, inseminates himself, generates the idea of the sun, circle with the dot in it, and at that point he has, in a sense, decapitated himself, because he is giving of his kingly unicity, the head that bears the crown is chopped. And in a sense, these primordial titans, these monsters, actually represent the divine, because there's nothing between them and the divine. So they represent a monstrous version of the divine unity. And this monstrous version of the divine unity will need to be decapitated to represent that which the divine has already done to himself. And in order to allow this whole process, this whole alchemical process, to be initiated, which will only end when everything is restored to its primordial unity and pure gold of the original, and be the king restored in full glory. So it's all about the fall that the divine unity allows to happen. So it is a sacrifice. This is a divine sacrifice that then re-expresses itself on a monstrous titanic level, which then is decapitated by the man who would be king, the man who would, as a hero, return through being a solar hero, which is interesting that these decapitated heads become sons, because essentially the traditional solar hero is attempting to rejoin the light of God and be absolutely subsumed in that light.
Well, that's a wonderful place to stop, Guy. Thank you very much indeed. Deeply appreciated.